I wanted to present to you today a project that I'm currently working on with my colleagues, Albert Zoe and Erin Ita. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we have not been able to collect data yet. So I'm going to present to you the background and the proposed method of the study. As you can see, my title, it's called In the Eye of the Beholder, Appraisals of Illegitimate Tasks. So the whole study focuses on a workplace stressor called illegitimate tasks. And those are tasks that violate what can reasonably be expected of a given person at their job. So it's a task that somebody feels falls outside of their job role. Traditionally, illegitimate tasks is considered to have two dimensions: unreasonable tasks and unnecessary tasks. Unreasonable tasks are tasks that fall above or below somebody's job status. So whether it falls above or below somebody's job level, their skill set, their experience, their training. For example, if a teacher is being asked to clean the school bathroom, mop the floor, they might think that that's an unreasonable task because it falls below their skill set and falls within the job of a janitor. Similarly, an unreasonable task might be, let's say, a new resident being asked to oversee a unit overnight. They might feel that that's an unreasonable task because it falls within the job role of somebody who's a little bit more senior and they don't have that experience. Unnecessary tasks are tasks that employees feel should simply just not exist, either because they don't make sense or they could be completed more efficiently if things were done a little bit better. And so an example here might be if a secretary is being asked to file paperwork that is no longer required by the company policy, that might be something that the employee feels, well, this is a waste of my time. Illegitimate tasks was developed within the stress as offense to self framework, which suggests that maintaining a positive sense of self is a basic goal that humans strive for. And according to SOS framework, illegitimate tasks are proposed to result in negative outcomes because individuals appraise them as a threat to their professional identity or their sense of self. This is because illegitimate tasks send negative social signals of devaluation and degradation to employees in their job roles, threatening their professional identity and therefore their global sense of self. And because of that, since the inception of illegitimate tasks, it's been categorized as a threat stressor. And unsurprisingly, research has shown that illegitimate tasks relate to a host of negative outcomes like decreased job satisfaction, decreased self-esteem, more negative emotions, employees engage in more counterproductive work behaviors, and they result in more psychological strains. And all these researchers have primarily drawn on SOS Framework's threat appraisal pathway to argue why illegitimate tasks result in all these negative outcomes. It's because they're appraised as a threat to their sense of self. And categorizing illegitimate tasks as a threat stressor is indeed consistent with the broader workplace stress literature, which categorizes stressors based on how they are assumed to be appraised. And the reason for this is because appraisal is thought to be the explanatory mechanism for why stressors result in certain outcomes. The Challenge-Hindrance-Threat framework outlines three stressor categories that are the most frequent and commonly discussed categories in the workplace stress literature. So they're challenge stressors, hindrance stressors, and threat stressors. Challenge stressors are those that employees feel or appraise them as offering future growth or gain or a future sense of competence or achievement. Hindrance stressors are appraised as interfering with somebody's work goals or a sense of achievement. And threat stressors are appraised as causing future harm or loss such that they threaten the self, like illegitimate tasks. And according to the Challenge-Hindrance-Threat framework, the reason why it's really important to categorize stressors based on how they are assumed to be appraised, like I mentioned before, is because different stressor categories relate to outcomes differently. Again, it's because that appraisal, the way that somebody appraises a stressor, can explain how a stressor will result in an outcome. And indeed, all three stressor categories, so challenge, hindrance, and threat stressors, they all result in strains. And that's because all stressors require employees or individuals to cope with the demands associated with the stressor, which will deplete their energy, deplete their resources, and result in strains. However, unlike hindrance and threat stressors, challenge stressors are actually a little bit different because they have the ability to result in positive non-strain outcomes. And this is because challenge stressors offer that potential for future growth and gain And as you see, an example here is motivation. Challenge stressors will positively result in motivation, and that's because they offer individuals the opportunity to gain those positive outcomes. So the current study takes a different, looks at illegitimate tasks a little bit differently and argues that not all illegitimate tasks are equal. It's possible that not all illegitimate tasks will be appraised as a threat, and therefore it's possible that they shouldn't be categorized that way. So what we are doing in our current study is we looked at the original conceptualization of illegitimate tasks, the traditional conceptualization of the unreasonable and unnecessary tasks, along with SOS framework, which argues that illegitimate tasks should be categorized as a threat, along with the Challenge-Hindrance-Threat framework, which discusses those three stressor categories and talks about how it's possible that certain types of illegitimate tasks might be actually appraised as a challenge or a hindrance. And if we can properly distinguish between these different types of illegitimate tasks, we can more accurately and comprehensively predict the different types of outcomes that illegitimate tasks will have. They might not always have that same impact outcomes the same exact way. So to illustrate, I'm going to draw on those examples that I discussed earlier. So I mentioned unnecessary tasks. Those are tasks that employees feel just shouldn't exist. And I spoke about how a secretary might be asked to file paperwork that is no longer required by company policy and how that's unnecessary. So when thinking about what hindrance stressors are, those are interferences to work achievement. Well, it's likely that unnecessary tasks will be viewed as a hindrance and interference. By having to complete all this unnecessary paperwork, it's taking away time from them being able to complete the tasks that actually fall within their job role. And research shows that completing tasks that fall within their job role, that's what's really satisfying, being able to meet your goals. And if we take the unreasonable tasks, the traditional dimension of it, and we think about, even though originally we didn't speak about how an unreasonable task that fall above somebody's job level is different from unreasonable tasks that fall below somebody's job level, but if we separate it, it's likely that they should be categorized differently. So for example, if we look at demoting unreasonable tasks that fall below somebody's job level, like in the example I spoke about, a teacher being have to mop or clean the bathroom floor, that's something that underutilizes somebody's skill set and therefore is likely to threaten somebody's professional identity because it might be viewed as devaluing and degrading and disrespectful. And that's the prototypical illegitimate task that we think originally was hypothesized. And if you look at promoting unreasonable tasks that fall above somebody's job level, it's likely that they might actually not be threatening, but actually might be viewed as an opportunity to prove oneself self-competence to their boss or to move up in the organization, to grow their skills. And because of that, it might not be a threat, but it actually might be a challenge. So here you see that it's likely that there are three different types of illegitimate tasks that will predict outcomes differently. And that's because they're likely to be appraised differently. So the first goal of the work was to introduce a refined three-dimensional framework of illegitimate tasks. This was based off of the original dimensions of illegitimate tasks. And as you see, unnecessary tasks stays the same, but we split unreasonable tasks into two, promoting and demoting unreasonable tasks. And since different stressor categories relate to outcomes differently, like I explained, it's likely that the different dimensions of illegitimate tasks should relate to outcomes differently as well. So the second goal of our study was really to look at whether different types of illegitimate tasks relate to outcomes differently. And since strain outcomes have different, since different stressors predict strain outcomes and non-strain outcomes differently, we wanted to look at both strain outcomes and non-strain outcomes. And I'm going to explain the relationships on the next slides, but the strain outcome we looked at was we will look at is emotional exhaustion. And that's a state of depletion from being overextended by the demands in the environment. Like I spoke about before, demands require you to cope and it reduces your energy and therefore will result in emotional exhaustion. Organizational based self-esteem is just somebody's self-esteem as an organizational member, whether they feel valued and cared for by the organization. And psychological empowerment is somebody's sense of intrinsic motivation in the workplace, whether they have feel that they have a sense of control in relation to their work. So as I mentioned before, it is likely that all types of stressors, and so all dimensions of illegitimate tasks should relate to emotional exhaustion because they require individuals to cope with the demands of the stressor and therefore will deplete their energy and result in exhaustion. However, if we look at organizational based self-esteem, it's likely that the different stressors will result will impact organizational-based self-esteem differently. So promoting unreasonable tasks, since they fall above somebody's job level, they're likely not to be perceived in a negative way, but in a positive way. If employees are able to cope and overcome the demands of the stressor, then they could prove their competence and they could grow. So because of that, they're likely to feel a higher sense of self-esteem as an organizational member. However, demoting unreasonable tasks, since they send these negative social signals to individuals at work, they're likely to threaten their professional identity and therefore reduce their self-esteem in the workplace. And unnecessary tasks, similarly, they're also likely to reduce somebody's self-esteem in the workplace because they hinder somebody's ability to achieve their goals and complete their tasks that actually fall within their job. Psychological empowerment, it should be a similar relationship. Psychological empowerment is intrinsic motivation in relation to somebody's work. So promoting unreasonable tasks, since they offer that future growth and gain, they're likely to make somebody feel motivated at work and therefore increase psychological empowerment. Demoting unreasonable tasks, since those are tasks that threaten somebody's self-esteem and they're really degrading and disrespectful, individuals should not feel motivated and therefore should not feel a sense of psychological empowerment at work in relation to those tasks. And unnecessary tasks, since those are interferences and hindrances to somebody's work, that's also likely to reduce somebody's motivation at work, reduce their psychological empowerment at work, because it doesn't provide them that opportunity that promoting unreasonable tasks do, that opportunity to gain that sense of accomplishment. The third goal of the study was to look at appraisal as a mediator. And as I said before, since appraisals are assumed to be the underlying mechanism linking different stressors to outcomes, the third goal really was to look at the different mediators. And I'm going to skip over because I know we only have 1 minute left, but since I categorize the different illegitimate tasks differently, I'm actually going to explicitly test those categories to provide an explicit test to my categories that I put here, and also the theoretical framework explaining why promoting, demoting, and unnecessary tasks should relate to outcomes the way that they're proposed to in the study. Since we don't have a measure to measure the 3 different dimensions, the pilot study, which was already conducted, developed a 3-dimensional illegitimate task scale. This was necessary to measure the study hypotheses, but it's also going to be very helpful moving forward for researchers to more accurately predict the different types of illegitimate tasks and show that maybe they don't all relate to outcomes the same way. And this scale has 12 items, 4 items for each dimension. And as you can see, it's good reliability for the overall scale and also for the individual dimensions. The proposed method, which should happen soon, it's going to be a daily diary study where participants will be required to report their daily experiences before work and at the close of the workday. So before leaving work for 2 consecutive work weeks. We're going to have a time 1 survey, which will be where they enroll, they're trained on how to complete the daily diary study and complete some demographic questions. And then the daily diary study will include all the study variables, and participants will have to report on all of them, and we'll track the fluctuations between individuals across the 2 work weeks. We are hoping to have a final sample of 120 participants. And the recruitment method will be through Academic Prolific, which is a crowdsourcing platform where participants can sign up and choose to participate in studies, and they are paid for it. The inclusion criteria requires that participants be full-time, have a tenure of 6 months so they know what falls inside and outside of their job role, and also have at least 1 coworker and 1 supervisor so they could report on illegitimate tasks that they receive at work. And for compensation, it should be a total of $43.50 if they can complete the entire study. And that's all. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, great presentation, Danielle. I see questions from Fred and Michael. Fred, please go ahead.
You're muted.
Fred?
Sorry about that. Yeah. Well, thankfully, none of you guys had to hear me clearing my throat. But anyways, my question is that since data collection has yet to start, I was wondering how the effect of the pandemic might be controlled for once the data starts coming in. Since my thought is that with a lot of workplaces having staffing shortages, roles or tasks that might be originally considered illegitimate might be done just out of necessity in a crisis situation. And by the way, thank you for a great talk.
Yeah, of course. And that's a really great question. And that's why it was delayed up front, just because of the pandemic. Many people weren't at work. And as you saw, our study requires that participants be at work, completed before the workday and after the workday. With illegitimate tasks, it's not, the way it's defined is whether somebody perceives the task to fall outside of their job role. So we're not really measuring the type of task, but rather whether they perceive it to be an illegitimate task. So in that perspective, it wouldn't really matter whether the job tests change. It's really about whether they perceive it to be an illegitimate task or not. And if they do perceive it to be an illegitimate task, then that's how we can measure their responses. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it sure does. Thanks for clarifying.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one more question time for Michael. Please go ahead. Please unmute.
Nice presentation, Danielle. I think you answered the first half of my question. The second half of my question is, what role do you think job autonomy plays in how someone perceives whether a task is illegitimate or not?
Well, can you clarify your question? Is it whether the job autonomy that they have at work in their job typically, or the job autonomy that is given to them with regards to that specific illegitimate task?
Like, for instance, in a demand control model, you'll find that sometimes people who have high job autonomy are motivated rather than stressed by, tasks that might otherwise, if you had low control over your workplace, psychological stressors. So I was wondering if you could speak to what role you think the control that somebody has over what they do actually affects their perspective. I know that's not exactly what you're studying, but.
No, that's great. I think that would be actually a very great moderator to look with regards to, in this study, because if somebody feels that they have more control over their work and more autonomy, then they might feel that they can maybe change their workplace. So if they're not getting, satisfaction out of that illegitimate task, they can maybe create more work in another way to complete, to feel fulfilled. Or they might also, their sense of autonomy, they might feel some pushback, and they might not feel that threat to their self-esteem and with regards to demoting unreasonable tasks, because they might have more autonomy at work, and therefore it won't impact them the same way. So they might not have that same appraisal there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great work.